Let us pray. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight. O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Once upon a time, there was a world whose people were divided and scared. They didn't want to be in the place where they were. They knew that they had to move forward, that the only way to move forward was together, but they were stuck. One side believed one thing, and another side believed another, and a chasm had opened between them that, if they were honest, neither side really believed could be bridged. Of course, they hadn't tried, but they were pretty confident it wouldn't work. After all, both groups thought they were on the right side. And perhaps more importantly, both groups thought the other was on the wrong side. And so there they stood, staring at one another across the chasm. And the longer they waited, the wider the chasm seemed to grow, the farther apart they seemed to find themselves, and they really couldn't hear one another. After all, they were just too far apart. And the world was growing dark. Now, to look at these people, one wouldn't immediately be struck by their differences, but rather by their similarities. It was hard to tell by just looking at them why they were so divided. After all, they all had the same basic architecture. Sure, some were bigger than others, some had slightly different skin tones, but they all had the same basic tools: 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 eyes, 2 nostrils, 2 ears, which, if you were to stop there, that is, with the ears, many of the challenges might have been overcome. That is, they might have been able to hear one another. But they also had this other thing, this other feature which, if they were honest, kept getting in the way of all of the others. That was the cause of most of their challenges, and that, of course, was a mouth. It wasn't the mouth's fault, really. They, too, were all basically the same: lips, teeth, tongue. Some were bigger than others, some flossed, some didn't. No, it wasn't the mouth's fault. It was what came out of that mouth. You see, in this little world, these people had been given a gift by their Creator. They could use their mouths to form words, to give voice to their thoughts. And with that gift came the power to create or destroy with a word. In the beginning was the Word. And with that power to create or destroy, they made use of their words. And sometimes they would use them to create, to do the most wonderful things, to say the most wonderful things to one another, to pull each other closer together despite the chasm that was between them. They would use their words to build each other up. to cheer each other on, to remind the entire world of the similarities that existed between all peoples. But there were these other times, these harder times, either out of design or out of ignorance, when they used their words to push each other further apart. These were the times when they used the words to demean one another, to tear each other down, when they used their words to confuse difference with danger. And when that happens, friends, the whole world suffered. And so there they stood on either side of this chasm, starting to get comfortable with being where they were. And the more time they stood on their side of the chasm, the more they grew comfortable with just being around the people who thought like them, who looked like them, who believed like them, or who thought differently about the other people who were out there. And they started to speak about the people on the other side of the chasm as enemies, to demean not their ideas, but their personhood. And their children were watching and learning. And as they grew, their children adopted the same rhetoric of otherness that had been so alive in their parents. And the chasm grew wider. The people were so comfortable being on their own side that they developed media outlets that spoke to their side and their side alone. They could hear just what they wanted to hear from the sources they wanted to hear it, without the burden of having to hear another point of view or another way to understand something. They just listened to that which they wanted to hear, and the chasm grew a little wider. And when those news outlets got done with the real news and ran out of things to talk about, they got to creating their own news. They learned that a lie told enough times would start to be understood as the truth, or at least truth-y. And that false truth, as it spread, began to focus on differences between groups. To focus on those people who believed differently, who looked differently, who loved differently. And the chasm grew. But the real challenge came, of course, when the people themselves started to find new ways of communicating with one another. They found a new way to let their voice be heard without the burden of having to look someone else in the eye when they spoke their words. They could now, in 140 characters or less, spit whatever vitriol they wanted out into the world without thinking for a moment that there was someone else who was receiving it. And things that people, good-hearted people, would never say to someone in front of their face would say out into the ether without the burden of worrying about how it would be received. And family and friends in this little world became foes. People that were thought once of as friends, as people you could connect with, were, through this communication without community, put on one side of that chasm or the other. And the funny thing was, the more that they were able to convince themselves that they could have communication without community, the more frightened they became. The more they were connected in this world, the more disconnected they became. That is, the further apart those two sides grew on either side of the chasm. And as so often happens when we get frightened, they started to make poor decisions. They convinced themselves that they didn't have to work to build bridges, that instead they could build walls. And the chasm grew. Now there was another group. On both sides of the chasm, there was another group of people who believed that things could be different, who knew that the impasse, the chasm, was not the way things were supposed to be, that knew that they wanted to work to build a bridge, to find a way over that chasm, but were a little confused on how to do it. Good people who were able to see across to the other side and think, how do I get there as one person? How do I get there if it's just me working in this world? And they threw up their hands. But there were some out there who still remembered the teachings of the Word. That is, the man who had come into their world to offer a different way. A better way. A way which led to life, not for some, but for all. They didn't have all of this man's teachings, but they had enough that they put many together in a book, which actually most people on either side of the chasm had. They just never really bothered to open it. After all, what could it say to this situation? It was confusing. And it didn't seem to offer much into this opportunity, but those few people who decided maybe we should just check to see if there's something in it that might offer a little hope into this dark world were surprised when they were reminded of what the creative power of a word spoken in love can do. In the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Word was in the beginning with God, and without the Word, no thing came into being. And what came into being through the Word was life. And the life was the light of all people, and the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. What came into being through the Word was life. And the life was the light of all people, and the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness could not overcome it. And these people who had grown so used to abusing words, to taking them for granted, to spitting them out without having to think about who was receiving them, these people were confused by this statement, but there were some who saw in it the hope for this world that was so divided. There were some in this who heard that message, who recognized the message of that word as perhaps the only hope that for this broken world, that the only way forward is the way of love. But it is a hard way. It means loving through our fears. It meant for that people speaking justice to indifference. It meant reminding the world that there were more things that united them than separated. It meant being willing to lay down one's life for the sake of another. And so perhaps unsurprisingly, many in that world chose a different way. An easier way. After all, if it couldn't save the Word himself, how could the way of love save them? But there was this group of people that just wouldn't let it go. Lucky for that little world, there was a group of people who gathered together regularly to remind themselves of what was at stake, who reminded themselves that no matter how dark this world seems, there is a light that is out there that is still shining, that we have to love through our fears. They would tell each other that there was hope in this world, that it is possible. These were they that reminded the people around them that they could disagree agreeably, that there was more that united than separated, that there was a light which shined in the darkness that no darkness could overcome. These were the people who remembered back to the very beginning. In the beginning was the Word, who remembered that they had to keep loving their neighbor, that they couldn't love their neighbor through a wall, that they had to work to build bridges. And so when the world felt like it was spinning out of control, these people got to work. And to be honest, some days were easier than others. There were some moments when their duly elected leaders would offer a very different perspective on life, who would promise greatness through division, who would promise these people that the higher they built their walls, the greater they would be. But these people knew there was something not right about that message. And though there were many good people who followed right along, they wondered why they couldn't see the way. And then they realized that they had to be the light for this world. That they had to be the people that would go into those dark places and remind people of the light. And it became much more difficult to speak justice, to love kindness, to walk humbly, but they reminded one another over and over and over again that their job remained the same, that they were called to love their neighbor as themselves, full stop. And that world began to listen. And the light started to shine. They seemed to know that sometimes it's only when the world feels dark that we can really see the light. And leaders came, and leaders went, and some leaders surprised people on both sides. But the people of the Word kept their word. They kept their promise to lead the world toward life. Not for some, but for all. And the life was the light of the world. You know, something strange happened. The people on either side of this chasm, though they didn't think in the same way, began to face in the same direction. Some had to turn to their left, and yes, some had to turn to their right, but slowly but surely they kept walking. With the chasm between them, they walked along and noticed something strange. That as they walked along, the further they walked in the same direction together, despite their differences, the chasm grew smaller. And pretty soon it grew small enough that they could actually hear the people on the other side. And as they walked along, step by step, moment by moment, day by day, they found that once they could hear, they could start to understand the others who had been so separated from them for so long. And as they walked along with this newfound understanding, as one would stumble, they would reach down and pull them up. As they walked along, they began to cry together and laugh together and celebrate together. And one day, they looked across the void to one another and discovered they loved one another. And on that day, the chasm was gone, left far behind them, for the sake of a new way of being in this world. They were no longer a divided people. They were still different, but they were finding their way in love together. Friends, these people discovered what we all must discover at some point in our lives. We are the light for this world. And I don't know about you, but as we move forward into these next years, this little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of